The image of the knight is often wrapped in romance, stories of shining armor, and noble quests, but the historical reality was far darker. Knights were products of a violent system that valued domination, loyalty to lords, and the ability to instill fear both on and off the battlefield. They were heavily trained, heavily armed, and tied to political and religious structures that gave their violence legitimacy. For ordinary people, a knight was not a symbol of protection, but a reminder that power in the Middle Ages rested on force, bloodshed, and the constant threat of war. Number 1. The making of a knight. Becoming a knight in the Middle Ages was a long and exhausting process, and it started much earlier than most people imagine. A boy who was born into a noble family could begin training as young as 7 years old. At that stage, he became a page, living in another noble's household where he learned the basics: riding horses, handling simple weapons, learning manners, and even serving at the dinner table. This early training was not about honor or glory, but about discipline and obedience. A page had to know how to care for weapons, clean armor, and show loyalty to his lord. By the time he reached his teenage years, he advanced to the role of squire. Life as a squire was far tougher. He had to serve a knight directly, helping with armor, sharpening weapons, tending horses, and following his master into battle. This meant that even before officially becoming a knight, a squire could face the horror of medieval warfare. In many cases, young squires were expected to prove their courage by saving their knight in combat, or by holding their own in smaller fights. Mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they could be fatal. The training itself was designed to create endurance rather than elegance. Squires practiced with heavy swords, lances, shields, and axes for hours. They trained on horseback, learning how to ride fast, keep balance, and fight with only one hand while guiding the horse with the other. They also had to master wrestling and hand-to-hand combat while wearing armor that could weigh more than 25 kilograms. This weight didn't make them immobile, but it drained stamina quickly. A knight had to be able to keep moving, stay on his feet, and fight effectively for hours. One of the hardest parts of training was jousting practice. Squires drilled at wooden targets, striking them with lances again and again to perfect accuracy and timing. Another common exercise was striking a rotating target called a quintin, which spun around and could knock a rider off his horse if he didn't hit it correctly. These lessons weren't just sport, they taught survival. In real battles, a misplaced lance or broken shield could mean death. The cost of all this training was enormous. Horses, armor, and weapons required constant maintenance, and only families with wealth and land could afford it. This financial barrier is one reason why knighthood was closely tied to nobility. But even with noble birth, not every boy made it through. Injuries, disease, or simply a lack of skill could end a career before it began. When a squire finally proved himself ready, usually in his late teens or early 20s, he was knighted. The ceremony was symbolic, an oath to serve his lord and defend the church, but the real test had already been years of training, bruises, and fear. A newly made knight was not just a warrior. He was the product of a system built to create disciplined fighters who could survive the brutal conditions of medieval warfare. Knights weren't just born into power. They were forged through years of struggle, preparation, and relentless exposure to violence. Number 2. Armor that was like a tank. Plate harness turned a mounted fighter into a moving fortress because every surface was engineered to shed force rather than absorb it. Mail never disappeared, but shifted to the gap's armpits, groin, and inside elbows, while rigid plates took over the vital zones. The pathway ran from coats of plates to full breastplates shaped like shallow domes. Angled ribs and subtle ridges stiffened the metal without extra weight, a trick that kept blows glancing off instead of biting in. Edges were rolled to resist splitting and to keep a blade from catching, and a lance rest on the right chest locked the weapon to the torso, so the shock of impact ran through armor and saddle rather than the wrist. Helmets evolved the same logic. Bassinets with visors gave way to tightly fitted armets, and closed helms paired with bavors, where narrow eye slits and drilled breaths balanced vision, airflow, and protection. Underneath, an arming doublet acted as a suspension system, its laces, points, anchoring each plate so the load spread across hips and shoulders. Padding underneath soaked up vibrations that could rattle teeth even when steel wasn't pierced. Articulation mattered more than mass. Lames linked by rivets and sliding hinges let knees, hips, and shoulders bend, turn, and rise from the saddle into a standing strike. On foot, gauntlets with flared cuffs guarded the wrist while keeping fingers nimble for a half sword thrust or Pollock's hook. Horses wore their own defenses, textile and mail barding at minimum, plate chanfront over the face, petrels at the chest, so the charge remained intact against arrows and javelins. The system wasn't invulnerable. Blunt force trauma could concuss through steel, and skilled opponents aimed for seams at the visor, armpit, or the back of the knee. Heat and breath control set hard limits during long fights and sieges, forcing short bursts of violence, step backs to recover, and constant maintenance of hinges, straps, and rivets. Yet, on the field, the combined geometry, metallurgy, and fit produced an effect that shifted battles. Missiles lost energy to curvature, blades skidded off, and morale wavered in the face of figures that looked and sounded like iron engines of war. Number 3. The battlefield was hell. Clashes in the Middle Ages were shaped by terrain, weather, and the grinding weight of logistics as much as by sword and lance. Most armies were not massive professional forces, but patchworks of levied peasants, hired mercenaries, and noble retinues, and when two sides met, the results were often confusion more than strategy. A knight's charge could break weaker infantry formations, but holding ground meant enduring mud that trapped hooves, rain that ruined bowstrings, and heat inside steel harness that could push men to collapse before the enemy even struck. Cavalry thundered in first impact, yet once the initial shock passed, the battle devolved into tightly packed melee where visibility through visors was limited, and fighters relied on sound and instinct to strike. Chroniclers describe shields splintering, arrows filling the sky in black swarms, and men trampled underfoot by their own side as formations buckled. Sieges intensified this brutality. Instead of short bursts of violence, they stretched into months of starvation and disease. Attackers built trenches, wooden towers, and artillery engines like trebuchets, which could fling projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over walls. Defenders responded with missiles, burning oil, and sorties to sabotage siege works at night. The constant pressure meant exhaustion was as deadly as blades. Psychological tactics were common. Decomposing corpses of animals and prisoners were catapulted into towns, spreading plague and terror. For civilians trapped inside, famine could drive them to eat horses, dogs, even leather. For soldiers outside, dysentery swept camps as quickly as enemy raids. The presence of armored knights added another layer of dread. Their advance in coordinated groups, weapons designed to puncture, crush, or cleave, created fear disproportionate to their actual numbers. Infantry facing them without comparable protection often broke before combat even began. Written accounts from battles like Agincourt or Teuton emphasize the noise of hooves, the blinding clash of steel, and the suffocating closeness where one mistake meant a spear through the ribs. Warfare in this period was not ritualized honor, but a grinding environment of mud, screams, and collapsing bodies, with knights acting as shock weapons in a system that cared little for human life. Number 4. Faith, fear, and the Crusades. When religious ideology merged with military structures, the figure of the knight became more than a warrior. He became an agent of sacred violence. The papacy framed armed service as a pathway to salvation, promising absolution of sins in return for fighting in the Holy Land. This was not just rhetoric, but an institutionalized incentive system that turned men already trained for brutality into fighters who believed their violence was sanctified. The crusading bull issued by Urban III at Clermont in 1095 declared that killing in Christ's name was not a sin, but a duty, reframing the act of war as spiritual labor. This conviction produced armies that marched thousands of miles under banners marked with the cross, willing to endure famine, disease, and desert heat because they thought their reward was eternal. Within this environment, military orders arose that combined monastic discipline with martial efficiency. The Knights Templar, for example, developed into a transnational force with fortresses across the Mediterranean and financial networks in Europe. They lived by rules of poverty and obedience, yet functioned as a permanent professional army. The Teutonic Knights extended this model into the Baltic, where campaigns against pagan groups blurred into territorial colonization. These orders institutionalized violence under religious vows, turning knightly warfare into a permanent crusade rather than a seasonal duty. The psychological weight of this ideology reached beyond foreign battlefields. In European villages, knights acted as extensions of feudal authority, backed by the church's moral sanction. A mounted retinue enforcing taxes or crushing dissent carried the aura of divine approval, leaving peasants with little distinction between